All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our session, Architecting Cloud Security in the Gen AI Era. Today, we'll explore how cloud native architectures, especially those with AI components, can introduce new risks, and how engineering and offensive security teams can collaborate and test to secure them. My name is Jessica Stinson from Bishop Fox, and today I'm joined by Stephen Smiley from ScaleSec. So with that, let's dive right in. But first, we'll do a quick round of intros. All right, as I said earlier, my name is Jessica Stinson. I am a solutions engineer here at Bishop Fox, and my job is really to align client goals with Bishop Fox Solutions by understanding things like compliance drivers, tech stacks, and overall business objectives. And my background before I became a solutions engineer was in penetration testing. And while doing that, I focused heavily on cloud and application security. Stephen, do you want to give us a background on you?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me today. So I work at ScaleSec as a security consultant, primarily around cloud security architecture and engineering. We do everything from assessments to architecture reviews and building, right? So we try to be on the side of the builder, but we also bring kind of an offensive mindset, which I think is interesting to have this conversation here. My background, I started my career as an intelligence officer for the Army, and that's where I really developed this mindset of using kind of the offensive perspective to improve your plans. I love how that aligns with what we do in the cloud. Yeah, thanks for having me today.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for the background and joining us. So with that, I will talk through our agenda today. So the topic of conversation today will focus on 5 key points. So first, we're going to talk about how upfront architecture can elevate your cloud security testing and why it's important. We'll also discuss the key differences between red teaming and cloud environments and how they differentiate themselves from cloud pen tests. We'll also talk about how to provision access appropriately and permissions within your cloud environments and why that's important prior to security testing and during. We're also going to discuss new ways to think about security testing in cloud environments that now include integrated solutions with GenAI technologies. And we're going to talk through specific client stories that we've experienced on the offensive security testing side. And finally, we're going to discuss how to make the most of your findings from your security tests and how you can start thinking of ways to harden your environment with GenAI as well. Alrighty. So let's move into our first topic of conversation, which is upfront architecture reviews. So Stephen, from your perspective, what are the key benefits of conducting these reviews prior to starting security testing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, there's different ways to do security testing, and I'm really interested to hear your perspectives on that. But I think that we like to start with trying to understand, what are you trying to accomplish? Like, what is your target architecture? And that'll help align everybody on key architectural components, right? Like what are the different pieces that you're using in your environment? Especially in the cloud, there's these different planes that we have to consider, right? There's like the cloud management plane, there's the network, there's application level, right? And like server level. And then we also want to be able to identify like what are your key data stores, right? So kind of outlining all of those pieces into a clear big picture. I feel like that's really important before you go into offensive security testing. And then the other part of it is like that architecture undergoes a lot of iteration during development, right? Usually somebody has some idea of how things are going to work, but over time it changes a lot. And then when you're ready to do a test, it's like does anybody have a clear picture of this thing anymore? Right? Like it's changed so much. And so I feel like that's a great opportunity to come back and step back, look at the big picture. And that helps you kind of focus your priorities in your testing. One of the things that we like to do is we try to build a threat model so that you're not wasting your time testing the wrong areas, right? So if we can try to identify like what are the key data stores in this environment that you really want to protect, that's like that will help target your testing to the right things. And the other part of this is this will help you develop an up-to-date diagram that actually will enable some clear communication. What we find is that without a clear diagram, it's really difficult to know you're talking about the same things as other people, right? Like you might have something in your mind, they have something else. But if you can have a diagram and be like pointing to these different components, then you can communicate much more clearly. And the other part of it is that during your test, you might find some things that are unknown or unexpected, right? But this diagram helps lay out like what do we expect to be there, right? And then an offensive security test might find there's other paths that you don't know about, right? That are vulnerabilities, that give you unexpected behavior. And so, yeah, that's what we like to do, whether it's under the name of an architecture review or a security assessment or something like that. But overall, we like to develop this blueprint. So I'm curious, Jessica, from your perspective on the offensive testing side, like how does this help you? If you come in with this clarity, like how does this help you in your testing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's always nice to talk to clients that come to the table with an architecture diagram in general, and just knowing that they've already kind of worked through the process of understanding their critical assets and just how their environment is laid out and how it interconnects with other accounts, right? So, like at the start of my discovery talks with customers, I'll often ask, well, how many accounts, how many subscriptions, and how many projects are important in this test? And sometimes they don't know. And that's where the architecture diagram is really a place that thrives to really get a good baseline understanding of all of the interconnected services. So really, at the start, it's clarity, right? So when clients can provide a really good diagram early on, it can give us immediate insight into their environment. That can be from understanding IAM policies, authentication flows, and how the networks internally and externally are interconnected. So we're able to see that all in one snapshot.
Nice.
Not just that, but oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, awesome. So it also helps with streamlining our testing. So we're going to get into this a little bit more, the difference between red teaming and cloud penetration testing. But in general, it allows both our penetration testers or red teamers understand where the crown jewels really are. What should we be targeting? What has sensitive data in it? What should we be targeting when we're trying to privilege escalate? And what are those critical integration pieces within their cloud environment? And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to our GenAI stuff. But it allows in the discovery process to ask very precise and informed questions, either during discovery or once a project has already kicked off with our consulting team. And it also just allows for just in general very strategic testing, right? So we can understand again how those systems are interconnected. We can understand if there's maybe a SaaS component that's connected to containers, and how all those are intertwined. In this diagram specifically, we were able to highlight some very specific targets that a consultant or red teamer would want to take a look at. Starting with AWS Identity Center, right? So we're going to want to target that, understand the policies and permissions behind it. So we can see, hey, maybe we can assume a role and privilege escalate that way, or laterally move into another account, something like that. Another area is S3 buckets. Specifically, this one is a logging bucket. So this is a place we could maybe go if there's sensitive data in there exfiltrate data, and maybe we'll find hard-coded secrets or stack traces that can help us with our testing process and chain vulnerabilities together. Another example is ECS Fargate. So maybe we want to target the workloads, exploit misconfigured task roles or container vulnerabilities to execute code. We can do that, possibly through SSRF, depending on what's vulnerable. So there's a lot of key areas that we can kind of focus on when we have those architecture diagrams. So that's why they're super important during the testing process and prior to. So Stephen, for organizations who haven't done this before or gone through this exercise, where should they start if they want to embed architecture reviews into their testing prep?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so actually, Mike, I have a question for you. Is like when you go into environments, do most of your customers have some clear architecture diagram? Like, have they thought about this beforehand?
I would say maybe about 50-50. But again, it's just super, super helpful when they have it ready for us and they have a really good understanding of where they're at. Because in the scoping process, which is where I kind of sit, I am trying to understand, okay, what are these critical accounts? Because a lot of customers come and they have, 10 plus accounts, and maybe they don't have the budget to test all 10 of them. So knowing what's critical and what isn't is key when we're trying to understand how to help customers.
Yeah. I mean, in my experience, a lot of customers, they don't even know how many accounts they have, right? Like,
Mhm.
it's just really easy to kind of lose focus on that. And so if you try to ask for an inventory, like, what are your critical assets? That's like, I don't know yet. Like, help me figure that out. Right.
Yeah.
And then, they might have diagrams, but they're usually outdated. That's what we find, which is fine because diagrams can be useful as just like a one-off thing, right? Like you make it to have a discussion and you're not necessarily going to always be updating it. But one of the things that we do try to do is help people kind of update those and build new ones. And depending on the environment, that can be a lot of work, but maybe it's not that difficult, right? Um, we we have tried out a number of tools to generate diagrams. I'm curious if you've done that. Like, do you guys ever try to generate a diagram based on someone's environment using various tools?
In my experience, I've used a lot of draw.io,
Yeah.
but I'm curious to see what's ScaleSet does.
Well, because there's a few different things out there. So, for example, like PMapper is something for like principal mapping, where you can try to create, a graph of different IAM relationships. Because
Gotcha.
that's one of the things that we're thinking about is not just this one policy, but how does this one policy maybe allow access to another role, and then that role, and so forth. And so PMapper is like something that we might use to try to develop that. There's also some for network, right? So trying to create a diagram of networks. And that's one of the things that I find gets really crazy complicated in the cloud, like not on purpose, but people will build tons of VPCs and all these interconnections. And so then if you ask like, well, what is your surface area to the outside? It's like, I have no idea, right?
Mhm.
And so we'll try to diagram some of those things out. But as you said, like draw.io or just like one that you build yourself is usually the most useful because it's not the diagram itself, it's like the process of wrapping your head around what this thing is doing. Um, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So okay, so you ask like how can organizations get started with architecture reviews? And I feel like just generating them based on a really good discussion is probably the most useful thing. It's like, what are you trying to accomplish going into this testing? So identifying those critical assets we talked about and the key data flows and the trust relationships. I mean, those are the key things that we would lay out. It doesn't have to necessarily include every single resource or every single cloud service that you're using, but just getting those key assets diagrammed out. So, and the other part of it is like, I don't know that I fully understand from how you guys work with like what is a cloud penetration test versus a red team engagement. Like, would you always want a diagram, or is there a case where you would just kind of want to go in completely blind? Like, how do you approach that?
Yeah, that's a really good segue into our next topic. So we'll talk about the differences. Move on to the next one. The differences between red teaming versus cloud pen tests. I get a lot of clients that come in and they say, "Hey, I want a red team," but that means different things for Bishop Fox, and it really depends on your goals, your maturity, and how much testing you've done in the past. So, with that, I wanted to put a little chart together to really highlight this stuff for anybody that's not familiar with the differences, right? But I'll let you guys read that as you want. But in general, a cloud penetration test is most ideal for organizations that maybe recently moved to the cloud. Their cloud accounts are very different, and they've gone through major architectural changes. Maybe they just want broad visibility into their misconfigurations and understand the vulnerabilities that exist because of those misconfigurations in their cloud environment or their environments. If there's multiple, typically there are. A cloud penetration test is going to be time boxed. It's going to be quick. It really focuses on understanding a wide range of issues in a certain amount of time. And so we're looking at systems, roles, and services and how they're all interwoven, again, in a very small time box amount of time. On the other hand, there's the red team, right? So in this case, I typically recommend a red team for organizations that have gone through actual penetration testing, and they're pretty mature from a security standpoint. And they want to simulate real world adversary issues that they, are trying to avoid. So they're testing not just their cloud accounts, account subscription projects, but they're also testing their defenses, and they want to understand if any of the activities can be picked up. And we'll get into more of the access and how that works between the two approaches, because I know you kind of asked about that, Stephen. But we can take this approach from the external surface as a red team, where we don't have any knowledge or any access, or we can have an assumed breach type of approach for a red team. And so in general, we just really want to understand, could an attacker get to our crown jewels without us knowing? That's the main question our customers are asking when they're looking at a red team. Whereas a cloud penetration test is misconfiguration driven. How many vulnerabilities exist and how many should I fix, going forward? So hopefully that clarifies it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, who do you tell that you're doing a test like this? Are you very open with all the teams? Like, do you notify the SOC that you're doing this, or do you try to see if they find you?
That's a really good question. So the SOC should be notified if you're doing a cloud penetration test. And it really depends on, because a cloud penetration test is going to be very noisy. We are not trying to evade detection. For a red team, it really depends on the customer. Do they want to be collaborative with our red team, or do they want us to do as much as we can without being detected as possible? We can take either approach. So the difference between the two would be an assumed breach approach for a red team or a complete black box. And in that case, don't notify the SOC if we're doing a complete black box with no knowledge. But if we're doing an assumed breach red team, absolutely, we can talk to the SOC. And our red team also does purple teaming. So that's when we are very collaborative with SOC members, and we are trying to run test cases so they can understand how to better improve their security posture when certain attacks are worked through on our red team. So
that makes a lot of sense. We've been setting up SOC, detections and alerting, and organizations don't always want to go through the trouble of actually testing those, right? Because I can set up detections for something that's unlikely to happen in the environment, But until I've actually observed it in the environment, it's hard to know with very high confidence that that's going to be picked up and alerted on in the way that we expect, right? And
Mhm.
so it sounds like a red team would kind of validate those detections a bit more. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good way to just level up your security in general. If you've gone through a few pen tests, you've remediated the issues that were found there, and you just want to see what the next step is. Like, what can actually happen, work through the TTPs, and just understand holistically what vulnerabilities could cause you the most pain.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
I've also found that that exercise can be valuable for determining like what are your most valuable data sources when it comes to threat detection, right? We when we set up a SIM tool, people like to jam like a ton of data in there, right? And it's like every network flow, every log from every machine, everything. And then it's like, okay, so how are we going to use this information, right? But with a red team type engagement, you can start asking the question of like, which of these log sources did I find the most valuable in detecting this activity? And which of them maybe I don't need to be paying for. And yeah.
Yeah, I found that's a common occurrence, absolutely. Um, but yeah, in general, it's great to kind of map out and understand the architecture in general, and then get a really good baseline through an architecture security assessment, maybe with folks like ScaleSec, and then perform that penetration test. It really depends on where you're at, understanding those critical assets. Um,
So so for customers that are looking to, do one of these tests, what kind of things can they do to get the most out of it? I understand that sometimes organizations do this out of obligation, right? Like they might have some compliance requirement to like do a pen test. But if they actually want to get the most value out of it, what can they do to set themselves up for success?
Yeah, again, I think we just need to make sure we're mapping out the environment, we're understanding all the accounts, subscriptions, projects, whatever the case may be. We want to understand how they're all intertwined. We want to gain those insights through that exercise. And then we might want to start with a penetration test and move on to red teaming later.
Mm.
Um, but whether it's a red team or a penetration test, the success can really heavily depend on access. So that is our next topic of conversation. So with that, Stephen, um, from your experience in designing environments or cloud environments in general, what challenges do you see around provisioning access and permissions?
That's a good question. Yeah, because we will design these IAM schemes, and it tends to be easy to focus on like the day to day needs, but we also think it's important to prepare access for less frequently used purposes, right? Which might be something like emergency incident response. Like when something happens, how am I going to let these people see, investigate? How are we going to perform audits from limited permissions? And then how are we going to enable the security testing that you're describing? Because of course, I would hope that I set up access that you can't get to you can't see anything, right? That your red team assessment wouldn't be very successful unless I set it up for you. And so, yeah, so if we set it up correctly, you won't see very much, but that would really limit the value of your test, right? So one of the things that we do is we like to think about all the different planes that have to be considered. So like in the cloud, we've got the cloud management plane, so like IAM to cloud APIs, but there's also network reachability, which may or may not apply depending on what kind of workloads you have, right? Like if your workloads are very serverless and they're not taking very much like network traffic directly, then maybe that's less important, right? If you just got API gateways and they're just coming in through this one path, that's fine. But if you're hosting a whole fleet of virtual machines and there's lots of subnets, now we have to think a lot more about how are we going to set up access for somebody to do a test from inside that network so that we can kind of assume a breach within that subnet, for example. And then, of course, there's application level authorization. Some customers might want to do a web application security test, and if they have no authorization to even like reach the page, then the test is going to be of very limited value, right? So getting them the right access as like a basic user so that they can scan more of the website is pretty important. So I guess what we're kind of describing is like more black box versus white box approaches. And I'm curious, like, what's your stance on that? Like, how do you find customers can get the most value?
Yeah. So we'll kind of talk through the different levels of access. So the depth of testing it really comes down to this, and it should again align with your goals, your risk appetite, your maturity level. Um, in most cases, whether it be a cloud penetration test or a red team, we're going to more than likely ask for access. And the only area that it really makes sense to do a complete black box approach is a red team, where you want to start from the external side and you want to see if your internal network can be penetrated from the outside. And we can do this in various ways, but this is this is all guesswork for our team, and we're working through to try to assume a breach on our own. And that takes time. It takes a lot of time. So when you're thinking about budget, this is not a great way to go. And especially if you want to understand the issues that are within your environment, it is always best to do an assumed breach white box approach, or a gray box at the very least. So again, really just depends on where you're at in your maturity level. I've seen a lot of folks want to do a black box engagement. If they're super mature, we're talking like big banks, big financial institutions that have gone through their own internal processes and testing. They've done a lot of third-party assessments, and they just really want to understand the nitty-gritty of what's out there and simulate very specific attackers or attacker groups and understand how they could approach it from our side. So let's see. But with that, I just, are there any other questions here that we can kind of talk through from your perspective, Stephen?
I'm curious, like, how does it change your approach if someone gives you a box that's like not something that you've got all your tools and everything loaded up on, right? Like, do they ever give you a virtual machine in here and they're like, you are only allowed to use what's basically in there, and not, you can't bring all your tools?
Yeah, I would more so say that's like a gray box approach.
Okay.
So they'll give us lower level access, but it's not full access. We don't have all the diagrams in front of us. We don't know all the attack paths. They're not willing to give us a higher level of access during a test. We're starting at the very lowest level, but we're internal still. And typically when I do, a cloud penetration test, we'll at the very least ask for a read-only role. So we can scan those misconfigurations that exist in your cloud environment. And then we will want a lower privilege role at the very least. Typically that'll look like a developer role or a staging access or a staging account that we can access to see if we can pivot into production or something like that. So that's more of a gray box approach. It's always easiest to test quickly and efficiently when you're doing a white box or assumed breach test, either red team or cloud pen testing.
Interesting.
Yeah. But with that, we're also seeing a big change in the way things are tested because of GenAI. So we're seeing a very disruptive shift. We're integrating AI into those environments, and we're trying to understand how to test those on a daily basis while things change. So with that, let's move into the new era. So, Stephen, how exactly are you seeing Gen AI integrations change architectural patterns?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So we're seeing a few different architectural patterns emerge here. So, and each one has its own risks. Um, so some are new and some are old, but we're just kind of thinking about them in new ways. So like one pattern we're seeing is applications are now calling to more external APIs, right? So they might be calling to an OpenAI endpoint, sending sensitive customer data outside their environment that traditionally they wouldn't have. And now they're having to, handle this untrusted input that's coming back from the AI model. And also, since that customer data might be sending to some external resource, now there's concerns about credentials exposure, right? So you're calling the OpenAI API, there's an API key. Well, if that API key is exposed, now all of those previous conversations, right, all those API calls can be retrieved from that using those credentials. And so that's a big concern. So just it's kind of the same challenge we had before of like properly handling secrets, but it's of really significant importance here. The other pattern we're seeing is calling APIs inside your cloud account. So this would be like inside an AWS account, you're calling Amazon Bedrock or SageMaker, the services that AWS is exposing specifically for AI services. And the issue we're seeing there is that these are often set up by data scientists, right? And they're doing a great job setting up their data, but they're not really software engineers considering security. And so they might be like, we're seeing like a SageMaker endpoint that's like way too exposed, right? That can be reached by network paths that they weren't expecting. And also, those things are getting fine tuned or trained on data, but no one's really considering like what are the protections around that data. So that's another important one. And then another one is people calling self-hosted APIs within their cloud account, right? So this would be like they're spinning up VMs and then running something on there that is doing the AI model. And the concerns we're seeing there is that none of that technology really is battle proven yet, right? Like these things can be hastily deployed. They're not well hardened, and that people can stand them up relatively quickly to get it working, but no one's considering the security implications of that. And then the other one, this is like much more emerging, but increasingly we're seeing applications allowing AI to perform actions within their application, right? So this is more on the agentic side, but like they're giving the AI permissions to, read customer data or send emails or, update records in the database, like things like that. And I think that like initially people were pretty hesitant to allow this to happen, but more and more they're seeing there's value there, and I want to allow this customer chat bot to interact with the back end of my application and issue discounts or provide data. But like by definition, that AI now has permissions to your environment and is a really untrusted actor. More and more there's frameworks and security controls being put in place around that. But again, those are really not battle proven, right? The behavior there is very difficult to predict. And definitely there's a fleet of people out there actively trying to manipulate those things for malicious purposes. That is a big area of research right now. And so it's just it's a big risk at this point. I'm curious from your perspective, have you encountered any like standout examples where you've encountered, new Gen AI risks during your testing?
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing a big uptick in these types of engagements. You know, customers can implement AI in various ways in their environment, right? They might just have integrations with ChatGPT and things like that, where their internal users are utilizing the tools to, you know, improve their workflow. And maybe they are using that to input sensitive data, and they might not understand the implications of that. Or we're seeing a lot of customers come to us with applications where they've bolted on essentially like a chatbot. Uh, and any external user from the internet can kind of utilize this chatbot and work with it to improve, you know, whatever is going on business wise that the client is trying to resolve for customers. In other cases, they're building their own AI models, and they might want to understand, can an attacker reach the AI model and steal proprietary data that we wouldn't want released, right? Or can they utilize those AI agents that we're building within our environment and attack us from the inside to gain information? So, with that, I will kick us off to a couple of client stories that are directly related to how AI is changing the way we're testing the cloud. So for this one in particular, we were performing a red team on the ML ops environment. We were specifically targeting the data scientist environment within AWS. So uh, this ML ops environment in AWS had proprietary AI model code and configurations. In this case, we began our red team engagement by emulating a newly onboarded contractor. In this attack path, we were able to identify an area where hard coded credentials were stored within a Git repository in which any newly onboarded contractor could access. Uh, and so once we found these credentials, there was no policy in place that denied us to STS assume role from a contractor to a data scientist. And those credentials allowed us to do so um, and pivot essentially into that ML ops systems environment. And we were ultimately able to exfiltrate model data without being detected. So this example isn't specific to testing generative AI, but it is an example of generative AI being a crown jewel for the red team. So this is something that they were specifically targeting. And if this was an actual attacker, the attacker would have had access to the proprietary data. And some recommended fixes once we found this was to first off implement secrets management like HashiCorp Vault. The credentials were out there, they were unsanitized, and we were able to see them. So that's the first issue. The next issue was to ensure that the principle of least privilege was enforced. Because it wasn't if we were able to STS assume role from a contractor to a data scientist. And second to that, there was no credential rotation. So, right, maybe we found credentials in the Git repository, but if they rotated those credentials, that wouldn't have been successful. And then finally, we recommended that they implement Git hooks to block commits that contain secrets. So if that were the case, then the hard-coded secrets wouldn't have been found in the first place. And so in this example, we can kind of see how chaining vulnerabilities together can get us to that final destination and get to the trophy target that we were looking for. So
Yeah, that's a really great example of how that whole chain of things, like any one of those blocked would have been enough to stop this from happening, right? And it feels like a kind of relatively simple architecture review, internal or external, would have identified those issues, right? But people are just moving so fast to try to build this that no one wants to stop and consider that the security of that application.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, data scientists are doing a great job, but maybe they don't understand the security implications, right, when they're building out these environments. And so that's where it's key to really review this stuff before it's released and ensure you're doing a really good security review. So
Mhm.
uh, I'll move on to the next case study. So this one's a little bit longer, a little more technical. So I won't go into too much into the specifics of how this was exploited. But in this scenario, and we're talking AI agents. And in this case, the AI powered agent was a help desk agent that connected to ServiceNow and Salesforce. And this was within the AWS environment. The goal here was to manipulate the AI agent um, to essentially gain access to customer data. So our our consultants were tricking the agent to exfiltrate data on their behalf. So they used a vulnerability, indirect prompt injection, specifically with the help desk agent chatbot, and they embedded an HTML comment within a support ticket in which the AI agent was able to parse, and they executed the embedded query, and it was able to pull the sensitive data from Salesforce because these were all interconnected systems. So the issue here wasn't just prompt injection. We're again chaining vulnerabilities together. We're using prompt injection to get to the crown jewel, right? So it was a lack of data flow control. So in the cloud, systems are deeply interconnected, but they can lack centralized oversight and how the data moves between them. So that's why overly permissive AI agents can become very important attack vectors and ways to pivot throughout cloud environments. So this is a really good reminder that in AI augmented environments, protecting individual systems may not be enough. You also need to understand and secure the invisible paths between them. So here we really recommend it to the client, hey, it's a good idea to sandbox and monitor your AI agents a bit better. Uh, Make sure there's some strict isolation boundaries. We recommended the camel solution, which that's an entirely different talk on its own, but that's a really good way to look at your AI architect, uh, the way your AI is architected and how to solution that better. We also recommended they perform output sanitization to make sure those links couldn't be rendered and exploited. And then finally, perform some more logging for the AI generated data access to make sure the SOC was alerted that this was even happening in the first place once the data started getting exfiltrated. So, with all of that, Stephen, what advice would you give teams architecting Gen AI connected systems who want to build in testability from the start?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in architecting your Gen AI, like connected systems, I would say that we prefer to use AI services that are from your cloud provider that are going to be much more well supported, right? Over self-hosting and like tying a lot of these things together yourself. And I'm kind of curious, like, do you feel like the technology landscape right now is mature enough that anybody can do these things safely, or do you feel like we're not there yet, right? Like there's no way to do this stuff
I
securely.
think I think this is it's reminding me a lot of when everyone was kind of lifting and shifting to the cloud in the first place. We're all kind of moving so fast, like you said earlier, and we aren't quite there yet. We're going to have to learn a lot of lessons along the way. Um, so yeah, I think it's just going to be a whole lot of lessons learned, a lot of figuring out what vulnerabilities are out there as people are building these models, as they're integrating everything into their cloud. From a Gen AI perspective, agentic AI is going to be a really interesting topic of conversation, I think, in the security field, specifically because I think it's going to be a really great target for most red teams, if that's being implemented within someone's
Mhm.
cloud environment. Right, we're going to really want to target those data flows and understand what can this agent do if we gain access to it. So
Because like I think the broad advice that we have is to expect that your whole tech stack around AI is going to change at least every year, if not every 6 months or sooner, right? So we're trying to help build architectures that are much more modular, right? That are going to plug and play with new models, new workflow engines, things like that, and try to understand what the contracts between those interfaces are. Because it's very likely that something new is going to come out and you're gonna be like, okay, I want to change over to this model, right? I want to change over to this workflow engine or this different interface. And you don't want to have to re-architect everything
yeah,
every time. And so trying to expect that and be ready for it is I think pretty good advice for at least the next several years.
absolutely.
Okay, so we do an assessment, we do an offensive security test, and at the end of that, you're going to come out with all these results about all the things that you can hack into, and you've got all these great findings. What do what do companies do with those and to get the most value from them, right? Like what should engineering teams be looking for? How do they take meaningful action after this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this brings us to our final topic, which is making the most of your findings. Um, so really, it's tough, right? So the key takeaways when you're getting that report, and the consulting team beat you up pretty bad. uh, we want to make sure that engineering teams are focusing on the vulnerabilities and prioritizing them appropriately, but they're really looking at the architectural lessons behind what they found during the test. So first, look at how the data is moving across the systems. This can show where the blind spots are, what the critical assets are that we need to be securing a little bit better. Evaluate whether least privilege is enforced properly and effectively by looking at those policies. If AI agents or automations in play, uh, review how well their permissions are assigned, because without those really clear boundaries and isolations, those agents can become an attacker's automation tool. Um, and so, understanding how smart your tooling is important. And finally, human oversight is going to continue remaining critical. So anytime sensitive actions are happening, it's important to require a review, and that there's a process on how to respond to suspicious activity when it's happening. So these are really the key takeaways we want to highlight, especially when you're looking at those findings in a report. We know as an offensive security firm, it can be hard to see those reports, but we're really just trying to help at the end of the day and make sure that your architecture is secure when you have, especially multiple accounts, subscriptions, or projects that are all interrelated. It can be a really hard thing to keep up with. So, on your side, Stephen, how do you recommend engineers use their test results to drive their architectural improvements quickly and efficiently?
Yeah. So my big thing is like try to address things right after that test when the information's still fresh. Whenever we have been able to collaborate with the pen test team and do some architecture review before, set up access, and then at the end come in and like address the findings. That's where we're seeing customers have the most success out of the whole process. Where we see customers get into trouble is they like call us and they're like, last year we had this pen test, and here are all the findings. Please help us fix these. And it's like, it's been a year. Like, none of these IPs are the same, right? Like, none of these resources are the same. Everything's changed. There's new stuff. Like, we can still work on that, but like, come on, like, let's address it now. And so my big advice is like, build this into the plan. Like, build both sides, your red team side and the builder side, into one collaborative effort of like, we are going to evaluate things and then fix them. And that is one effort that we're, at the end of this, we're not just going to have, a list of problems, but we're going to have our problems fixed. And so that's what we try to do, and push people towards, thinking about it as a collaboration together. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always great when there's the collaboration piece there. Yeah, it's great insight. And I really appreciate it. It's been a great talk. I do want to make sure, I know, we talked for a while, that we kind of go through any questions that folks might have that either of us can hopefully answer. The
I see a question here at the bottom that's asking, do we think that the benefits of using Gen AI outweigh the security risks? I think that my answer to that, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts as well. My answer to that is like, probably, yeah, right? Like, if you have a real business use case of using Gen AI, I don't think you need to be afraid of the security implications, right? Like, we can help architect around that and mitigate sufficient risks. So I don't think you should have to be afraid. I just think it has to be done deliberately with the right guardrails in place. Don't give an AI like full access to your database. Like, your example there that showed like basically SQL injection through a chatbot. It's like, come on, like, give that AI agent controlled access to queries that make sense, and limit what it can do, right? And the tooling for that is maturing, and we're getting there. So I don't think you have to be afraid of using Gen AI integration, but you just have to do it deliberately.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think a low and slow approach it's hard to do depending on your business model, right? When you're integrating this stuff. But, I think the entire world is moving this way, and there's kind of no way around it. If you want to compete, you're probably going to have to implement some sort of AI into your world, whether it's, building applications and making them, competitive in the market. You might need to lean into this a lot. Uh, but I do think it's always important to test throughout the process, so you can really understand the security throughout the life cycle, because things change, right? Development teams will push changes, daily, and so there are new ways in the market that we are trying to work through these things. For instance, Bishop Fox, we do testing throughout the year on an application as opposed to a point in time. So I think that can be a really good way to keep up with your, security posture, from a continuous side rather than just a point in time, especially when you're implementing new AI into your spaces, whether that be the cloud or applications.
Yeah. You talked about the secure, life cycle, right? We've talked about that for a long time. In particular, we'll say, do a threat model even before you build something, right? Like, just during your development, as you're developing your architecture, think about the model. I know that gets left by the wayside for many, many organizations, but this is one area where it probably provides like outsized value, right? Because there's just a lot of new risks and new things to think about, that it's not the same as just deploying a static website, right? Like, that one, maybe you don't need to think so much about like the threat model, right? It's like it's a much more proven pattern. But all these new Gen AI integrations are not proven patterns, and you should probably think about it early in that life cycle.
Absolutely. Yeah, and starting with an architecture review is a really good place. So absolutely. That's great. Maybe we have time to answer one more. Stephen, did you see the next
Let's
one?
see. What's the most overlooked misconfiguration red teamers are exploiting in cloud environments?
I would say it's usually permissions issues. Um, and there's, a misconfigured policy. Folks are trying to create these policies customized, and it ends up, causing mayhem depending on what it is, right? So we saw that in the last client story, right? Just an STS assume role for a contractor allowed them to gain access to, what they shouldn't have. So it can be that's usually what I see as the main issue, and it's typically a chain vulnerability. So we take a low, finding, and then we're able to elevate privileges in other ways. So
Mhm. I mean, IAM is just still the most valuable thing in the cloud, right? And it's still really hard to get right. Um, so we definitely help people try to build those schemes, but it's difficult, right? Like IAM actions are not always clear if this is super privileged or not. Even a read-only, um, a read-only policy can sometimes grant read to sensitive data, right? That's not
mhm,
always a benign policy to give. So it takes much more consideration than people normally do give it.
absolutely, I agree with that. Right, might have time for one more.
Do these recommendations apply equally to SaaS and PaaS platforms? Right, like if you have a SaaS architecture that's serverless, how does this change the picture?
Mm. Yeah, that's a broad question, but I would say even with SaaS and PaaS, it usually boils down to configurations and policy and permissions within those. Um, but I I think there's a little less going on because there's another owner to the application itself. So the responsibility kind of changes in a sense. But that's my experience. That we should be testing, both regardless.
Yeah. That's my perspective as well. I mean, I think in general, the higher up the stack you go towards like a SaaS, I think there's more clarity about behavior. If you've got a Lambda function, like this is all it's going to do. It's kind of hard. It's much harder, but not impossible, to trick a Lambda function into doing something else, right? And that Lambda function has a certain set of permissions. That's all it can do, right? And so it's a lot easier to think about, what are the potential implications of the abuse of this Lambda function. Um, so I think it can change, but it's still mostly going to come down to, as you said, IAM and permissions, especially with SaaS and PaaS.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, thank you. I think we are at time. So as we wrap up today, I just want to leave you all with some resources that maybe you can check out. We definitely have some more in our GitHub, but it was great talking with you today, Stephen. I think it was a really productive conversation.
Awesome. Thanks
So,
so much for having me.
yeah, thank you all.